Hi friends, I am Uday Kandpal and I welcome you back to yet another lecture on NCERT Class 8 History Chapter 3 with Fact Elaboration by Uday Kandpal. The name of the chapter is Ruling the Countryside. So we will talk about how was the rule along the countryside. So let's start. So the company becomes the Diwan. On 12th August 1765, the Mughal Emperor appointed East India Company as the Diwan of Bengal. The actual event most probably took place in the Robert Clive's tent with a few Englishmen and Indians as witness, but in the painting above, event is shown as, or painting above in the book, the event is shown as majestic occasion taking place in a grand setting. The painter was commissioned by Clive to record the memorable events in Clive's life. The grant of Diwani clearly was one such event in the British imagination. As Diwan, the company became the chief financial officer of territory under its control. Now it had to think of administering the land and organizing its revenue resources. So the revenue for the company. The company had become the Diwan, but it still saw itself primarily as trader. It wanted a large revenue income, but was unwilling to set up the regular system of assessment and collection. Within 5 years, the value of goods brought up by the company in Bengal doubled. Earlier, the company had purchased the goods in India by importing gold and silver from Britain. Now, the revenue collected in Bengal could finance the purchase of goods for export. Soon, it was clear that the Bengal economy was facing up a deep crisis. Artisans were deserting the villages since they were being forced to sell their goods to the company at low prices. Peasants were unable to pay the dues that were being demanded from them. Artisanal production was in decline and agricultural cultivation showed the sign of collapse. Thus, in 1770, a terrible famine killed about 10 million people in Bengal. About one third of the population was wiped out. So we'll talk about the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 was a famine between 1769 and 1773, or in Bengali calendar it is 1176 to 1180 in the Bengali calendar, and that affected the lower Gangetic plain of India from Bihar to the Bengal region. The famine is estimated to have caused the death of about 10 million people, and the Warren Hastings 1772 report estimated that a third of the population in the affected region starved to death. The famine is one of the many famines and famine-triggered epidemics that devastated the Indian subcontinent during the 18th century and 19th century. It is usually attributed to the combination of weather and the policies of the East India Company. The start of famine has been attributed to a failed monsoon in 1769 that caused a widespread drought and two consecutive failed crops. The devastation from the war, combined with exploitative tax revenue policies of the East India Company after 1765, crippled the economic resources of the rural population. The famine occurred in Bengal, then ruled by the East India Company. Their territory included the modern West Bengal, Bangladesh, and parts of Assam, Odisha, Bihar, and Jharkhand. It was earlier a province to the Mughal Empire from the 16th century and was ruled by a Nawab or governor. In the 18th century, as the Mughal Empire started collapsing, the Nawab became effectively independent of the Mughal rule. In the 17th century, the English East India Company was granted the town of Calcutta by the Mughal Prince Shah Shuja. During this following century, the company obtained a sole trading rights for the province and became a dominant power in Bengal in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. The East India Company defeated the Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah, annexing a large portion of the Bengal afterwards. In the 1764, the military control was reaffirmed at Buxar. The subsequent treaty gave them taxation rights known as the Diwani. The company thereby became the de facto ruler of Bengal. The regions in which the famine occurred affected the modern Indian states of Bihar and West Bengal in particular, but the famine also extended to Odisha and Jharkhand as well as the modern-day Bangladesh. Among the worst affected were the regions of Birbhum and Murshidabad in Bengal, and Tirhut and Champaran and Betia in Bihar. So the need to improve agriculture. After 2 decades of debate on the question, the company finally introduced a permanent settlement in 1793. By the terms of settlement, the Rajas and the Talukdars were recognized as Jamindars, and they were asked to collect the rent from peasants and pay revenue to the company. The amount to be paid was fixed permanently. That is, it was not increased even in future. It was felt that would ensure the regular flow of revenue into the company coffers, and at the same time encourage zamindars to invest in improving the land. Since the revenue demanded of the state would not be increased, the zamindar would benefit from the increased production from land. The revenue had been fixed, was so high that the zamindars found it difficult to pay. Anyone who failed to pay the revenue lost his zamindari. Numerous zamindaris were sold off at auctions organized by the company. By the first decade of the 19th century, the situation changed. The prices in the market rose and the cultivation slowly expanded. This meant an increase in the income of zamindars, but no gain for the company since it could not increase the revenue demand that had been fixed permanently. Even then, the zamindars did not have an interest in improving the land. Some had lost their lands in the earlier years of settlement. Others saw the possibility of improving the earning without the trouble and risk of investment. As long as the zamindars could give out the land to the tenants and get rent, they are not interested in improving the land. On the other hand, in the villages, the cultivator found the system extremely oppressive. The rent had to be paid to the zamindar was high, and his right on the land was insecure. To pay the rent, he had often taken a loan from the moneylender, and when he failed to pay the rent, he was evicted from the land he had cultivated for generations. So what is permanent settlement? The permanent settlement, also known as the permanent settlement of Bengal, was an agreement between the East India Company and the Bengali landlords to fix revenues to be raised from the land that had far-reaching consequences for both agricultural methods and the productivity in the entire British Empire and the political realities of the Indian countryside. It was concluded in 1793 by the company administration headed by Charles Cornwallis. It formed one part of the larger body of legislation known as the Cornwallis Code. So this is Cornwallis Code, a part of legislation of Cornwallis Code. The Cornwallis Code of 1793 divided East India Company's service personnel into three branches: the revenue, judicial, and the commercial. The revenues were collected by zamindars, native Indians who were treated as landowners. This division created an Indian land class that supported British authority. The permanent settlement was introduced first in Bengal and Bihar and later in the South District of Madras and Varanasi. The system eventually spread all over North India by a series of regulations dated 1 May 1793. These regulations remained in place until Charter Act of 1833. The other two systems prevalent in India were the Ryotwari system and the Mehalwari system. Mehalwari. So the Mehalwari system was introduced by Holt Mackenzie in 1822. The other two other systems were permanent settlement in Bengal in 1793 and the Ryotwari system in 1820. It covered the states of Punjab, Awadh and Agra, parts of Odisha and Madhya Pradesh. During the 1800s, the British established a control over the administrative machinery of India. The system of Land Revenue Act as a chief source of income of the British. Land was one of the most important source of the incomes of the British. Thus, they used land to control the entire revenue system, strengthening the economic conditions in India. The word Mehalwari is derived from the Hindi word Mahal, which means a house, district, neighborhood, or a quarter. The system consisted of landlords and the zamindar or the lumbardars claiming to represent the entire village and even groups of villages. Along with the village communities, the landlords were jointly responsible for the payment of the revenues, but there was individual responsibility. The land included under this system consisted of all the land of the villages, even the forest land, pastures, etc. The northwestern provinces and the Oudh province were two important territories acquired by the East India Company in modern Uttar Pradesh. In 1801, the Nawab of Awadh surrendered the districts of Allahabad to the company. The Jamuna and the Ganga valleys came to the British after the Second Anglo-Maratha War. The Governor General of India, Francis Rawdon Hastings, first Marquis of Hastings, conquered more territories of North India after Third Anglo-Maratha War in the year 1820. The village headman or lumbardar was completely responsible for all the recommendations, the survey of lands, preparations of the records of rights in lands, settlements of the land revenues, remand in the mahals, and the collection of the land revenue. The regulations of the 1822 accredited the legal sanction to these recommendations in cases where the estates were not held by the landlords but by the cultivators in the common tenancy. The state demand was allowed to be fixed at 95% of the rental. However, quite unfortunately, the system broke down as the state demand was excessively large and it was quite rigid. The amount payable by the cultivation was quite more than what they could afford. This system was prevalent in the parts of Uttar Pradesh and the northwest province, parts of central India and Punjab. The government of William Bentinck, the Governor General 1828 to 1835, made a thorough revision of the regulation of 1822 and thus Mehalwari system was introduced. They realized that the result of the regulation of 1822 was nothing other than widespread misery. After a prolonged consultation, the government finally passed a new regulation in 1833. The Mehalwari system of land revenue was introduced by Holt Mackenzie and Robert Martin Bird. It played a large part of the making of the system more flexible. The process of preparing estimates of produce rents was simplified too. It also introduced the fixation of average rents for the different classes of soil. This scheme functioned under the Metin's word. The processes of measuring land, examining soil quality was improved further. The state demand was fixed at 66% of the rental value, and a settlement was made for 30 years. The Meherwadi system of land revenue worked under the scheme of 1833 was completed under the administrationship of James Thompson. The 66% rental demanded proved very harsh too. In the Sahanpur rules of 1855, it was revised to 50% of by the Governor General James Brown Ramsay, the first Marquis of Dalhousie. However, the British officers hardly cared about these rules. They created widespread discontent among the Indians. The Ryotwadi. The Ryotwadi system was a land revenue system in the British India introduced by Thomas Munro in 1820 based on the system administered by Captain Alexander Reed in the Baramahal district. It allowed the government to deal directly with the cultivator Ryot for the revenue collection and gave the peasant freedom to cede or acquire new land for cultivation. The peasant was assessed for the only the land that he cultivated. The Rotwari system is associated with the name of Thomas Munro, who was appointed governor of Madras in May 1820. Subsequently, the Rotwari system was extended to the Bombay area. Munro gradually reduced the rate of taxation from one half to one third of the gross produce. Even then, the excessive tax, the levy was not based on the actual revenues from the produce of the land, but instead of an estimate of potential of the soil. In some cases, more than 50% of the gross revenue was demanded. In northern India, Edward Colebrook and successive governor-generals had implored the court of directors of the British East India Company in vain to redeem the pledge given by the British government and to permanently settle the land tax so as to make it possible for the people to accumulate wealth and improving their own condition. Payment of the land tax in the cash rather than in kind was instituted in the late 18th century when the British East India Company wanted to establish an exclusive monopoly in the market as buyers of Indian goods. Critics asserted that in practice the requirement of cash payments was ruinous to the cultivator, exposing him to the demands of moneylenders as an alternative to the loss of land and starvation where the crops failed. The zamindari system explained. In Bengal and northern India, the zamindari system was as follows. To collect tax from land, the British had zamindars bid from the highest tax rates. That is, the zamindars quoted a tax rate that they promised to obtain from the particular land. The highest bidder was made the owner of the land from which they collected the taxes. The farmers and the cultivators who owned the land lost their ownership and became the tenants of their own land. They were to pay the landlord zamindars a tax for the land only in the terms of cash and not in kind. If a zamindar was not able to collect the quoted amount of tax, he lost the ownership. By comparison, this is the way taxes had been collected by the king. The tax should be paid by either in the cash or in kind. The payments in kind were mostly in the form of land which was given to the king. The king never made use of those lands which could not be brought back by the farmers after they back some money. The farmer owned his land. The tax rates were reduced in the case of famine, bad weather of the in the serious event. The difference are those since the farmer had to pay only in the cash under this new system, he could not sell it to the fellow farmers who started using the land for cultivation of a different crop and therefore was not willing to return it. The farmer eventually lost some part of his land to someone else and consequently retained a highly awkward remnant of land for cultivation. This led to excessive marketing of land, which lost in the sentimental grip on the farmer. The land became merely a commodity. Also, because of the political scheme of subsidiary alliance, the pressure on the agricultural land made things worse. It led to the failures of administration, leaving the blame on the feudatory king of province, and therefore the British easily could take over the administration. Now we'll study about Sir Thomas Munro, the first baronet. The Munro was born in Glasgow on 27 May 1761 to the Glaswegian merchant Alexander Munro. Thomas' father was a tailor who proposed a successful investment in American tobacco. After working as a bank clerk, Alexander Munro joined the family's prosperous tobacco business but was ruined by the collapse of the tobacco trade during the American Revolutionary War. Thomas was also claimed to be a direct descendant of George Munro, 10th Baron of Fewlish, died 1452, chief of Highland Clan Munro, but clan historian R.W. Munro has contested this claim. He served with his regiment during the hard-fought war against Hyder Ali 1782-83 under his namesake Major Sir Hector Munro, 8th of Navarre. Thomas also later served alongside another namesake John Munro, 9th of the Danish. Thomas served again after with his regiment in the first campaign against Tipu Sultan 1790 to 1792. He was chosen as the fourth military officer to administer the part of territory captured from Tipu, where he remained for 7 years learning the principles of revenue survey and assessment which he afterwards applied throughout the presidency of Madras. After the final downfall of Tipu in 1799, he spent a short time restoring order in Kanara, and therefore another 7 years, 1800 to 1807, he was placed in charge of the northern districts ceded by the Nizam of Hyderabad, where he introduced the Ryotwari system of land revenue. After a long furlough in Britain, during which he gave valuable evidence upon matters connected with the renewal of the East India Company's charter, he returned to Madras in 1814 with special instructions to reform the judicial and police systems. The crops for Europe. By the late 18th century, the company was trying its best to expand the cultivation of opium and indigo. In the century and a half that followed, the British persuaded or forced the cultivation in the various parts of India to produce other crops: jute in Bengal, tea, Assam, sugarcane in the United Province, now Uttar Pradesh, wheat in Punjab, cotton in Maharashtra, and Punjab in rice in Madras. Why the demand for Indian indigo? The indigo plant grows primarily in the tropics. By the 13th century, indigo was being used by the cloth manufacturers in Italy, France, and Britain to dye cloth. However, only small amounts of Indian indigo reached the European market, and its price was very high. European cloth manufacturers therefore had to depend on another plant called wood to make violet and blue dyes. Being a part of the temperate zone, wood was more easily available in Europe. It was grown in the northern Italy, southern France, and parts of Germany and Britain. Worried by the competition from indigo wood product producers in the Europe pressurized their governments to ban imports of indigo. Cloth dyers, however, preferred the indigo as a dye. Indigo produced a rich blue color, whereas the dye from the wood was pale and dull. By the 17th century, European cloth producers persuaded their governments to relax the ban on indigo import. The French began cultivating indigo in Saint Dominique in Caribbean islands, the Portuguese in Brazil, and the English in Jamaica, and the Spanish in Venezuela. Indigo plantations also came up in the many parts of North America. By the end of the 18th century, the demand for Indian indigo grew further. Britain began to industrialize, and its cotton production expanded dramatically, creating an enormous new demand for the cloth dyes. While the demand for indigo increased, the existing supplies from the West Indies and America collapsed for a variety of reasons. Between the 1783 and 1789, the production of indigo in the world fell by half. Cloth dyes in Britain now desperately look for a new sources of indigo supply. Now we'll talk about indigo revolt. So the Indigo Revolt or Nil Bidroh, or the Blue Rebellion or Revolution, not revolution but rebellion, was a peasant movement and subsequent uprising of indigo farmers against the indigo planters that arose in the Chaugacha village of the Nadia in Bengal in 1859. Causes leading to the revolt. Indigo planting in Bengal dated back to 1777, when Louis Bernard French introduced into the Indians. He was the first indigo planter of Bengal. He started cultivation at Taladanga and Golpar near Chandranagar, Hooghly. With the Nawabs of Bengal under British power, indigo planting became more and more commercially profitable because of the demand of the blue dyes. In Europe, it was introduced in the large parts of Burdwan, Bankura, Birbhum, North Chaubish Parganas, and Jessore. Present Bangladesh. The indigo planters persuaded the peasants of the plant indigo instead of food crops. They provided loans called the dandon at a very high interest. Once a farmer took such loans, he remained in debt for his whole life before passing it to his successors. The price paid by the planters was meagre, only 2.5% of the marketplace. The farmer could make no profit to producing indigo. The farmers were totally unprotected from the indigo planters, who resorted to mortgage or destruction of the property if they were willing to obey them. Government rules favored planters. By an act in 1833, the planters were granted a free hand in oppression. Even the zamindar sided with the planters. Under this severe oppression, the farmers resorted to revolt. The revolt started in the villages of Govindpur and Chaugacha in Krishnanagar, Nadia district, where the Bishnu Charan Bishwas and Digambar Bishwas was first led the rebellion against the planters in Bengal 1859. It was spread rapidly in Murshidabad, Birbhum, Budwan, Pabna, Khulna, and Narel. Some indigo planters that had given a public trial and executed. The indigo depots were burned. Many planters fled to avoid being caught. The zamindars were also targets of the rebellion peasants. The revolt was ruthlessly suppressed. Large forces of police and military, backed by the British government and the zamindars mercilessly slaughtered a number of peasants. British police mercilessly hanged great leader of Indigo rebels Vishwanath Sardar alias Bishne Dakat in Santnagar. Nadia, after a short trial, some historians opined that he was the first martyr of Indigo revolt in undivided Bengal. In spite of this, the revolt was fairly popular, involving almost the whole of Bengal. The Biswas brothers of Nadia, Kadar Mola of Pabna, and the Rafiq Mondal of Malda were popular leaders. Even some zamindars supported the revolt, the most important of whom was Ramratan Malik of Narali. So, hope you learned a lot for your competitive exams. Thank you for watching. Bye bye. Have a nice day.